So welcome again. Thank you for joining us this evening, this morning, this afternoon. We have a great program for everyone today. Topic we're going to be discussing is Basic Education and Literacy Global Grants, your keys to successful projects. I'm Carolyn Johnson. I'll be the moderator for this evening. I'm a member of the Rotary Club of Yarmouth, Maine in the United States, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. I'm also the chair of the Basic Education and Literacy Rotary Action Group. With me this evening are Abby McNear, who's the Director of Grants at the Rotary Foundation, and Jo Jean Francois, who is the Area Focus Manager for Basic Education and Literacy. And I will introduce each of them more fully when they're ready to speak. I wanted to take a minute to talk a bit about the Basic Education and Literacy Rotary Action Group, who we are and what we do. BELRAG members are Rotarians from all over the world who are interested in literacy and in education projects. And our four core things that we do is increasing awareness of literacy and the impact of illiteracy on the quality of people's lives. Creating an awareness among Rotary clubs and Rotarians on how they can strengthen the capacity of communities to provide education and literacy. Assisting Rotarians to increase the scale and effectiveness of education and literacy projects. We do quite a bit of outreach to clubs who are putting together global grants or putting together projects and do consulting for them to make sure that the projects that they're doing are going to be effective and meet the criteria for global grants. And we do a lot of collaboration with Rotarians to establish partnerships for projects, working with our colleagues in water and sanitation, working with our colleagues in conflict resolution, and establishing partnerships, and also partnerships with other organizations that are involved in literacy and education. We have a nice partnership with Save the Children. We're actually getting involved in a partnership with the Encyclopedia Britannica and some other organizations as well. The column on the right talks about the different kinds of areas or the different areas for basic education and literacy projects. Sometimes Rotarians focus primarily on primary schools or elementary schools. And certainly that is an area to be involved in, but there are so many other areas where education and literacy is needed. Early childhood projects, girls' education, providing education for children or people with disabilities, working with out of school and underperforming youth. And I believe we're going to do a webinar in this in the next couple of months, because out of school and underperforming youth with the pandemic and the number of students that are out of school now and likely will not be returning to school is going to be something that we all need to be paying attention to. Technology education is another area where we're looking to do a follow-up webinar. A lot of interest in technology education and in distance learning, and so doing some work with Rotarians on best practices there. Providing professional development for teachers, adult literacy, and access to different kinds of resources such as libraries. These are all areas where Rotarians can and should be involved, both in their own communities and for international projects. Wanted to spend a minute just to really emphasize the impact of Rotary grants and the impact of basic education and literacy grants. This is a graphic showing the total funding for grants from when global grants began in 2014 up through 2019. Nearly $60 million in BEL projects, and a total of almost $500,000 in Rotary Foundation funded grants since the inception of global grants. Here you can see how global grants have been funded for the combined amount for teacher training and technology with training is almost half of what has been spent total for BEL grants in the last 7 years. Where do our funds go and where are our projects primarily located? Nearly 21% have been in India. Almost 28% of BEL grants have been located in Asia. About 23% have been in the Americas, both North, South, and Central America. And about 18% of basic education and literacy grants have been focused in African nations. And just a few more statistics. Over the course since 2014, when we first rolled out global grants, for the last 4 years, we've averaged about 175 BEL grants each year. That fell significantly to about 113 grants last year, which I would suspect had a lot to do with the pandemic. And similarly, our grants over the last few years have averaged around $11 million, again, with quite a drop off this past year to just shy of $8 million. Again, I would expect because of the pandemic and people that had their emphasis focused in other areas. So I'd like to start our program tonight by introducing two Rotarians who I can say are valued colleagues and have worked with both of them for quite a long time, and would also introduce them both as friends. First, we're going to hear from Abby McNear. Abby has been with Rotary for over 20 years. She's been the Director of Grants for the Rotary Foundation since 2012. She managed the pilot of the Foundation's Future Vision Plan, and she served as a program officer for district grants and global grants. Abby's first position with Rotary was with the Foundation's Ambassadorial Scholarships Program. She has also managed youth exchange and other programs. Abby worked with the Council of Legislation and then rejoined the programs division, where she managed RI's recognition programs and resources for clubs and districts to carry out international service projects such as World Community Service, Rotary Volunteers, Rotary Community Corps, and Rotary Action Groups and Fellowships. In addition to her work with Rotary, Abby has arranged European concert tours for amateur performing groups, and she's also a freelance writer. She holds a BA in history from Brown University and a master's degree with honors in nonprofit management from North Park University in Chicago. Abby attended law school at the University of Illinois Champaign. She is conversant in both Italian and understands French. And Abby is a member of the Rotary Club of Evanston in District 6440. Abby, welcome, and thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you. Do you want me to go ahead and get started, Carolyn? All right. I am going to share my screen. And hope that everyone can see this. Excellent. So I just want to express my thanks to BELRAG for inviting us here this evening and offering this opportunity for us to get together, talk about basic education and literacy projects that receive global grant funding. We're delighted that all of you made time either tonight or this morning. I saw that we have participants from all around the world tonight, which is just wonderful. And I'll stop saying tonight eventually. So I'm joined by my colleague, Mary Jo, who is our manager for basic education and literacy. So what we'd like to do is I am going to give a basic overview of global grants and drawing some examples from basic education and literacy for those of you who are newer to this and wanting to find out a little bit more about how you get funding for global grants. And then Mary Jo will be taking us on a much deeper dive into what these projects look like quite specifically for basic education and literacy. So let's start. What is a global grant? So global grants are the foundation's flagship activities. This is where the foundation invests a large chunk of its funding to help Rotarians do some of these larger, more holistic, really effective projects within their communities, within the areas of focus. We have seen really wonderful work done with basic education and literacy using these grants. So we'll be talking more about that. So these projects are a little bit different from matching grants. They build on the best of what we used to see in the matching grant program. So these are projects that start with budgets of $30,000 or more. We have seen projects that go all the way up to $1 million, but they start at $30,000. The funding for these receive a match on DDF. There is a 100% match for any DDF put towards these projects, and sponsors can use any combination of cash, DDF, the World Fund match. There are some named gift opportunities out there that I'm sure Penny could give us a talk on, but you can combine all of those to meet that minimum threshold of $30,000. One of the beautiful things about global grants is that they all involve an international partnership. So you have your club in the community that is working very closely with the schools and parents in the community to find out what is needed. And then you have this support and partnership from abroad to help make these projects come to fruition. So it's just a really beautiful way to use the Rotary network to make big things happen in your own community and to be part of big things that are happening abroad.
Abby, could I ask you to go into your settings and put it on full screen? We're seeing your notes and it's small, hard to see.
Okay, yeah, that's a shame. Let me see if my PowerPoint will cooperate with me. Isn't this what they always say, that technology is great as long as it actually works? So let me see what it will do here.
I think if you go to slideshow, Abby.
I am. It's unfortunately doing something with, I have a double screen going and it doesn't want to show, it's showing the wrong screen is basically what it's doing. So bear with me for just one moment. I'm really sorry, everyone.
All right.
All right. Well, that's a shame. I have it nice and big on the other slide, and let's see if this helps. Okay, unfortunately, I think this is about the best we're going to get.
That's fine, thanks.
Is this visible? I'm so sorry, everyone, but hopefully you can all see it and we will get on to our correct slides. All right, so The Rotary Foundation does have areas of focus where we fund most of our work. I think probably everyone on this webinar is familiar with the 6 areas of focus that both the foundation and RI have had since I think 2010. So you see them listed here, and this is very exciting. And of course, we're here to talk about basic education and literacy, but we had a very exciting development this past June in that both the trustees and the board approved a new area of focus for us in the environment. So this is something that is going into effect this July 1st. We will begin funding global grants for the environment. Those of you who are interested in this, in addition to basic education and literacy, I'd encourage you to go to the Rotary website. We have policy statements up on the website describing what activities are possible through the environment. And I think you'll see some things there too that are focused on work you can do in schools. So I know that Carolyn shared with me in advance of this presentation that there were a number of questions that people had about sustainability in global grants. And sustainability is a requirement that we have put into the criteria for global grants. And, we are not talking about environmental sustainability here. We're talking about providing a long-term solution to a community that the community can keep going even after the project ends. So that all sounds good on paper. But as we see time and time again, when people sit down to kind of think about a project and design what they're doing, they hit that part of the foundation's requirements and think, I have no idea what that means or how I'm going to proceed with that. So I'd like to term it in a slightly different way and a very BEL-centric way, which is that when you're looking at how to make what the project or activity that you're doing sustainable, what we are asking you to do is think about the big goal, what you're hoping is going to happen as a result of whatever you're doing. And I would argue that in the case of basic education and literacy, the big goal is almost always better educated children. So when you keep that goal in mind, what we want to see as you sit down to design a project is how are the things that you are doing going to connect up to that big goal of a better educated child. And in the project, we're going to ask to see how you're connecting the dots to reach that goal. And because a lot of times people sit down to do a project and you think, well, if we supply computers, for example, of course we're going to have better educated children, because if you use computers, you're going to be better educated, you'll be computer literate, and that's enough. But in fact, it really isn't enough. If you're supplying a piece of equipment like that, you need to include some other steps to actually have a situation where you have teachers who are enthusiastic about this equipment, who know how to use it, who can think of ways to incorporate it into their teaching methodology, who can get the children excited about it, so that in the end, you do have a better educated child. And so that is what we are getting at with our sustainability requirements, is how it's really the requirements to ensure that your project succeeds and ultimately achieves the result that you intended when you set out to do the project. That's the overarching philosophy behind it. But as we sat down and went through all the things that make projects work really well, there are really 6 indicators we've seen that if a project has some of these, the odds are that they have designed a sustainable project. So we'll talk about that. And the very first thing that we have seen is starting with a community assessment. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute. Mary Jo is going to take a deep dive with this, but really you need to go out and talk with the people you want to help. And whatever you're doing, you want to be designing it together. And that's how you build that real ownership in the community. We'll talk more about this in just a moment. The next thing that you want to do is encourage local ownership. And by this, what we mean is that it isn't just that the Rotary Club has come in, done this wonderful thing, and now the Rotary Club is gone, and the people who benefited from the project really don't feel like it's their project. So if something goes wrong, they can't fix it. They're not going to do anything. They're going to wait for the Rotary Club to come back. And that's not a situation we want to see. You want to see that real partnership, that investment, that excitement about whatever the activity is, so that afterwards the community itself wants to keep it going. Almost every global grant, and especially with basic education and literacy, we always want to see a training component. You know, one of the biggest things that we see in school systems around the world is a real need for professional development for the teachers. The governments, you know, the teachers to be licensed have to have been certified by the government, done some basic exams. But you know, education is constantly evolving. There are always new things people can be learning, new methodologies that are going to, again, spark their imagination, spark excitement, and make people just better teachers, which then you have your better educated children. A very important step for any project is the idea of buying locally. And this becomes important not only because it helps the local economy in wherever you are working, but also because you want the materials or things that are provided to be appropriate for the area in which they're used. So if it's equipment, what that means is that it's possible to get parts if something breaks. If it's purchased locally, then you have the option of being able to repair it eventually. With educational materials, of course, this becomes critically important that if the materials are purchased locally, they're going to be more appropriate for the children with whom you're working. You know, we see this quite often with things like projects where you're shipping books. And, you know, we've seen this from time to time with, you know, shipments of books in American English into areas that use British English. So the spellings are different. And there are issues with that. You want to have things be culturally appropriate and accessible nearby. Finding local funding is a real key. A lot of times, some of our very best basic education projects have been one where the Rotarians have gone in and provided the funding to kickstart a new initiative in the schools, something new that the schools want and that's really critical for educating those children. And oftentimes the Ministry of Education maybe doesn't have the funding to get something started, but once it's in progress, they are willing to step in and continue it. And this is where Rotary clubs can really use their connections to work with people in the government or the education ministry to gain support for the initiatives that they're starting and be able to keep those things going. So this is something that is just a really wonderful piece if you're able to put this together for a project that you're looking at. And finally, all global grants, one of the things that we really like to see in this is that it's possible to measure the success of the project. And quite frankly, with basic education projects, that's oftentimes easier than it is in other areas of focus, because most school districts are regularly assessing their students and is seeing where they are in terms of learning. So this is something that even your partners in the school, or if you're working with a cooperating organization, can help you do this piece of the project in terms of measuring. All right. I promised you a little bit more about community assessments, so I'm going to talk about this in more general terms, and I think Mary Jo is going to give you some hands-on examples. But first, let's talk about what this is. And this is really connecting with the people you want to help and talking with them to find out what is actually needed. And you want to find out what's needed, and you want to find out about the things that they're already doing well, and things that can be built upon to make the project even better. When it comes to a basic education and literacy project, the community that you're working with typically includes school administrators, teachers, parents, and could even include some of the students as well, to find out, what they like about their school, what they don't like, where there are gaps in teaching skills, things like this. And it's those kinds of groups that you want to incorporate and really talk to and design the project with them. So the benefits of doing this are numerous. It helps build ownership for the project. It deepens ties between Rotary and the communities where we're working. It builds a lot of trust around the project. So again, you don't have that situation of people just sitting back and waiting for Rotary to come back and fix something. It's people feel invested that this is their project. But very importantly, it also helps you make decisions about how to prioritize things in your project. I think oftentimes in schools, you can go in and there are an overwhelming number of needs, and it's sometimes hard to know where to start. But if you're talking to the people who are working in those schools, attending those schools, they can really offer important guidance on where to begin, what to start with, and where to go. Now, I think a lot of people, I've certainly heard this, get very intimidated at hearing the idea of a community assessment. And I have heard I do not have a master's degree in sociology. This is not something I'm capable of doing. And I'm here to assure you, you are capable of doing this. Community assessment does not require an advanced degree. It does not require a lot of money. It does require some time. But we have an excellent publication available on the website that can help you with how to do an assessment. It gives 6 different templates of approaches to doing this that you see outlined there. I would encourage you to take a look at this if you're feeling unsure about community assessments and see what's involved. I think you will come away feeling pretty confident about moving forward with doing this. So just a few tips in doing an assessment. Again, I think it certainly happens to me. You walk into a situation sometimes and you look at things and you think, well, it's very obvious what is needed here. And sometimes the things that one assumes are actually not the greatest needs. So it's important to remain open-minded, be prepared to be surprised. Find out things you just didn't know. I think it's also important that you include, different groups, particularly ones who might be marginalized. I know an example that we hear time and time again with schools, if you do a group, oftentimes with the administrators and the teachers together, the teachers will be very reluctant to contradict anything their administrators are saying. So sometimes when you get the different groups together by themselves, you can learn a lot about what is needed. Another key tip that I would offer is not to promise a project before you actually make a decision. And again, I think, when you're talking to people, it can be, you can get really excited because you see things that are lacking, and you know ways that you could help, and you feel like you can definitely do this, and can make promises. And then later, as you go to map out the project and what is possible, it might not always be possible to do everything you were originally thinking. And you can lose a little bit of credibility with the people you're working with if you're coming back and going, oh yeah, that thing I promised you, well, that's not going to work out. So it's better to collect information, remain open-minded, and then go back and kind of do your homework about what is possible and what your club is really willing and able to take on. All right, Mary Jo's going to get into all of that a lot more, but I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what happened in the grant programs last year. It was an interesting year for us in terms of grant activity. So our district grants, you all may be familiar with those for your smaller projects. This type of funding is excellent for providing needed equipment in schools. If you ever come across something like that, where there's just a real need for equipment, district grants are the place to go. But global grants last year was so interesting. As Carolyn was saying, the pandemic struck March 11th, I remember. It was declared. And at that time, I was sitting there thinking, my goodness, we are going to have no grant activity for the remainder of the year because no one can go out to look at things. And I couldn't have been more wrong. Rotary, we are people of action, and it was stunning and moving to see the degree to which Rotary clubs swung into action to do everything they could to address the pandemic. The grant activity went through the roof, so much so that we completely exhausted the global grant budget in mid-May last year, funding numerous projects to help address the pandemic. In addition to all of those, the trustees and the board pumped a lot of funding into disaster response grants, which districts were also using to address the pandemic. And you can see here we had $8.4 million in disaster response activity. It was just amazing. And when we look at the breakdown of the grants from last year, basic education and literacy had a respectable number of grants with 113 and almost $8 million in funding last year. But if you take a look at disease prevention and treatment, where we had almost $60 million in funding for over 700 grants, I mean, it was really, that is the pandemic response. And you see it right there, just amazing. So last year, Carolyn had shown you some of the broader categories for basic education and literacy projects. This is how it lined up last year. You might be thinking, what is other? And other, most of those projects were part of the Simple Schools pilot that the trustees had tried for 3 years to fund the construction of schools. That pilot ended last year, but we had a number of projects in the other category. So you see that in terms of school construction and things like that. All right, that brings me to the end of my presentation. I will turn things back over to Carolyn. I don't know, I think we're holding questions until the end. So I will stop here and thank you.
Thanks, Abby. That was great. Good information and really appropriate, well-placed information, particularly about community assessments. Yeah, this is something that all of us can do with a little creativity and imagination. So thank you very much. The benefits certainly from community assessments far outweigh the challenges in doing them. It's huge. Our next presenter this evening is Jo Jean Francois. Jo is the area focus manager responsible for supporting Rotary efforts related to basic education and literacy. Working in education, both in the US and abroad, she began her career working at the state government level, quickly realizing that her interests were really focused on strengthening education policies in schools. She left her work in government to become a volunteer teacher in Haiti. This decision led to her continued education work in Haiti, where she was involved both before and after the 2010 earthquake. Jo served as the Director of Community Development for the Haitian Project, Country Program Manager for Outreach International, and she finished her time as the Education Manager and Education Technical Advisor for World Vision. While at World Vision, she managed the education, advocacy, and disaster risk reduction portions of a $5 million education grant program from the Canadian International Development Agency. She has also served on the UN Education Cluster as a strategic group member. Jo is most focused on education programming and particularly passionate about community assessments in education, teacher training, and program evaluation. She joined Rotary as the area focus manager for BEL in April of 2013. I think, Jo, I met you about the third day on the job. Her work centers in applying the Rotary Foundation's grant-making policies, encouraging high-quality project design in implementation of Rotarian-led projects and initiatives, and cultivating strategic partnerships. She also co-manages the Washington Schools Target Challenge. Jo holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Loras College and a Master of Science in Public Service Management from DePaul University. Welcome, Jo, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Carolyn. And it's true, we did meet over the phone on about my third day of work when I was suddenly asked if I would, actually on my first day at Rotary, somebody asked me, Jo, could you please organize a breakout session at the Lisbon Convention? It's in 2 months. You can't go, but can you organize it from Evanston? So I dug through a bunch of Rotarians' names and I met Carolyn, and the rest is history. So thank you so much for having me today. And Abby, thank you so much for the information you provided. It's always great to get that idea around global grants and what's really successful from a general perspective. And I look forward to sharing with you today a little bit of a deeper dive, as Abby said, into community assessments, as well as some of the other sort of challenges we see when we have BEL grants coming through. I won't be touching on every single project type because we would be here all night, but I am going to talk about some of the key components to the most common projects that we see come through in global grant applications. So I don't know, I think I'm going to be preaching to the choir here, but just to get ourselves in the mindset about why education. Rotary has 6 areas of focus, soon to be 7, as Abby pointed out, and all of them sort of rely on one another if we want to truly make the world a better place. But I think that when it comes to education, I always ask people to, imagine what it might be like if you didn't have your education and how that would change your life. So think about the most important thing that you have in your life right now, whether it's, your family or your career or whatever. How would that be different if you didn't have an education? So I know for me, as a mother, and as a wife, as a mother, I'm always working to help my kids in school. But most importantly, I think about when I lived in Haiti and I would help my husband at a clinic that he worked at on the weekends sometimes. And we'd have parents come through who would bring their children in for something very simple. It could be, some sort of an ear infection or a skin infection. And we would go through the process. We would give them, the child would get its exam. And at the end of it, we would give the parent the medication for the child, and we would go through and explain everything to them. And oftentimes we had doctors from overseas, and they would say to the mother or the father, and I know this is a lot of information, so it's all written down for you right here. If you need, when you go home, if you have any questions, just refer back to this information. And so many times you would see the look on the parent's face of fear and embarrassment because they couldn't read the information that was being given to them. Even if it wasn't in the local language of Creole, they couldn't read it. And, as a parent, and now every single time I go with my children to the doctor and the pharmacist gives me that, the slip on the medication and how to use it, I feel particularly grateful and recommitted to my passion of making sure that we're able to provide education so that no parent ever has to feel that way ever again. So I think, we can ask ourselves why education, but the other thing we want to ask ourselves is what kind of education do we want to be providing as the Rotary Foundation and as Rotary International? And in 2015, the UN updated its Millennium Development Goals, which had said from 2000 until 2015, we as a global community were going to try and get every child enrolled in school. Of course, we didn't meet that goal in those 15 years. But what we learned is that we enrolled a lot of students in school, but what we didn't do was a very good job at educating them. So we saw many children coming to school, some returning to school, but what we found was that they weren't learning as well. And so the UN then, when they revisited those goals in 2015, changed the goal so that it was not just accessing education, but it was making sure that children are receiving quality in their education. And so the way I like to think about it is, we can bring a runner to the starting line of the race and get them set up and ready to go. But unless we give them the training and the tools and the practice that they need, and until they hear you say ready, set, go, they don't have a chance to win the race. Or even to compete and get a medal. And so it's the same as education, by providing children access to school, by getting them in the front door, we're getting them to that starting line. But if we want them to be able to complete the race and really have a chance to compete, we have to make sure that we're also providing them the quality of the education that they deserve. And so we have to look at that from the entire race and not just from the starting point. And there's a lot of challenges to get to where we want to go. And I don't think I'm going to need to run through all of these global statistics with you. And obviously there are many more that can highlight the challenges that we face as a global community trying to provide education to students. We know that reading proficiency isn't where it needs to be for kids, even many of whom attend school every single day. We know that we need higher quality teachers and that we need more teachers in order to achieve our goals. We also know that children with disabilities are at an increased disadvantage for accessing and receiving quality education. And girls also have a much higher risk of dropping out of school before they have a chance to go to secondary school. These are huge challenges, and it's not just important to focus on these challenges on an individual basis because we feel for the children and we want them to receive a good education. But in order to increase, to get families and communities out of poverty, education is so critical. In order to increase the GDP of countries, education is so critical. Lowering disease, education is shown, especially with mothers and children, to lower disease and increase lifespans of people. And so education it's a challenge, but it's worth running the race because the benefits surely outweigh the challenges that we face. And as Abby said, and Carolyn said that, then we reached this new obstacle last year, and this new challenge of COVID-19. And I couldn't help it as Abby was talking about how our response was in disease prevention and treatment, which was so appropriate at the time. One of the things I've been reminding people is that the long-term effects of COVID-19 in education are unknown right now, but it's possible that this could affect education for years and years and years to come. Because as Carolyn said, what ended up happening is a lot of kids had to leave school, and they run the risk, the kids who of course are in the most desperate situations, of never coming back to school. And as an education community, that's especially concerning to us, because it's very difficult, particularly in certain communities where you might have children that need to work to support the family, or young girls are getting married in order to bring in a dowry for the family, things like that. It's going to be really hard to get any of those people back in school, at least at a school age that's appropriate for primary school. And so now is the time to act, and we have to do that through a wide variety of ways. And probably the first step to that will just be messaging, simple messaging, and working with local governments in order to bring those kids back into school. But I think that there's a lot of hope, and I see so much of it coming out of what Rotarians are doing in the field. I see it in your grant applications every single day. And I think that the best way to achieve, to overcome some of these challenges or obstacles is to do high quality and sustainable projects. And I know I'm going to be probably beating a dead horse here a little bit, but I do want to talk briefly about community assessments and how important they are when it comes to education projects, all projects, but I think I've seen the benefit of doing the community assessment within the education sector firsthand, and it's really, really important. So a simple needs assessment is just going to focus on the deficiencies and that a community has, and it ignores what the strengths are. Whereas a community assessment seeks to empower community members. It allows them to take ownership of their community and of their lives by coming up with their own solutions to some of their challenges, and utilizing the strengths that they already have within their community instead of just providing them with a prescription. And I know that you might be thinking to yourself, well, this is obvious, but you'd be surprised how many projects we see come in that have a prepackaged solution to a problem that has been seen, or to a problem that probably exists in the community, but we don't know if it's necessarily the priority of the community to meet that need, or if it's, if it's already being met in a different way. Sometimes you don't know that if you're doing the community assessment. And what I can tell you from my own experience, and I think Carolyn would back me up on this, is that if you walk into a school around the world and you say to somebody, hey, do you want, to a school principal or director, hey, do you want computers? Their answer is going to be yes. Do you have electricity at your school? No, but we'll find a way to get electricity if you give us the computers, So it's really important that that you spend time talking with the community, and that you hear more than just what their needs are, or ask them if they simply want something. And one last thing, when I used to work in Haiti, I used to do a lot of community assessments. When I would go into a school and talk to school directors, especially, they would tell me every single thing that was wrong with their school. They would list it out, and it would be very sad and very depressing. And I would say, well, what's right with your school? And they would say, well, what do you mean? I said, pretend like you're selling me a used car. You're not going to say to me, oh, it doesn't run very well, and the battery barely ever works, and the motor is getting ready to stink out, and the door falls off when you open it. No, you're going to tell me, like, it runs great. Sometimes it needs a little extra this or that, but it gets moving. It gets you to where you need to go. And it looks a little dingy right now, but with the right paint job, it could look really, really great. I want you to sell me your school and tell me why I should be investing in the education of your students because of the strengths that you have here. So I often get asked what the best type of format is for community assessment within basic education and literacy. And I found that the greatest success that I have is through focus groups, working in small groups within a school or a set of schools where you're separating the groups of people out. So you might talk to a few school directors together. You could talk to some school teachers together, 6 to 10 school teachers at a time. And if possible, try to make sure that the school administrators are not in the same room so that teachers can feel free to openly express themselves. Same thing with parents and students in the focus groups. You can separate them. If you're going to be talking with a group of students, I always ask people to remember, please, that there are child protection rules that we have to follow, and having another adult in the room with you is important, particularly maybe someone from the school. But focus groups, and I can't overemphasize the importance of including students in your assessments. Students are, they're honest. Sometimes they're brutally honest, and they say a lot of things that, you know, the school director doesn't maybe want you to hear about, but they'll always tell you like it is. And so they sometimes are your biggest informants when you're doing a community assessment. Town hall meetings are another great way just to see how the community interacts with one another. You can learn a lot from it. So it's not just, you know, within the town hall, you're not just hearing about you know, hearing from people, but you're sort of seeing how the community interacts with each other. Who are the well-respected people in the community that you might be able to work with on your project? How are the women perceived? Are they speaking up in the crowd? If they're not, then maybe that's an opportunity for you to pull together a group of women and have a focus group with just them. Town hall meetings, I think, can be really beneficial with the school community, and it gives the entire community a chance to come together and actually sometimes realize that maybe they're solving their own problems and they don't even know what each other are doing. So that's always a great tool to use. One-on-one interviews are great, especially when you are working with people from the Ministry of Education or school directors. I find that interviews are really helpful. And I think surveys are good too, although you have to consider who your audience is when you're doing the survey. So if there's low literacy levels in the community, you want to be sure that there's a way that people can comfortably share their survey answers with you. The benefit of a survey is usually that it's anonymous. So if you have a group of people that can't read and write, then you'll have to find a way to still make sure that the confidentiality is still there, but it can certainly be done. And also, anytime you're using surveys, you have to consider a language. So I'll use Haiti as an example. If you're giving out surveys in French, maybe Creole is probably the more appropriate language to be using, because not everyone speaks or can read French. And then also any type of barriers having to do with disability. Are there people that are blind in the community and may not be able to participate in a typical survey? Excuse me, when it comes to focus groups, I get asked a lot, like, well, I don't even know, you know, like Abby was saying, this is just very overwhelming. I don't even know what I would say if I sat down with a group of teachers or a group of parents or a group of whoever you would sit with. So these are just, you know, some examples. And I think that the biggest thing you want to make sure of is that you are not asking yes or no questions, that you are not saying, do you want X, Y, and Z? That you are not asking leading questions. So you wouldn't want to say, like, so tell me about how much, you know, you open it up with, well, tell me how much better of a teacher you would be if you had computers in your classroom. You know, we really want to make sure that we leave this open-ended so that you can have a free and open conversation to hear what's really important for, in this case, teachers or parents or students, and have a little fun with it. My favorite question to ask a group of teachers, especially, is if you were named the Minister of Education tomorrow, what would be the first thing you would do to make education in your country or your community better? And it's, you know, in a lot of places, the first look I get is like, okay, lady, I can't even think that way. I'm just a teacher. I don't even communicate with the Ministry of Education. But, you know, the more you kind of chat with one another back and forth about it, and have a little fun and get to know the teachers or the parents or whoever, the more open people become. It becomes a more trusting conversation and relationship, and it certainly is empowering. So I'm going to be very honest with you and share with you some of the red flags that we see come across our desks in community assessments. One of the biggest ones is that if you're working in 30 schools and we receive 30 identical community needs assessments, that every single school in your community needs exactly the same thing, exactly the same number of things, that is a big red flag. And we're going to ask you some questions about that. Another question that we ask on the community assessment form that we use is something to the effect of, what needs were expressed that this project will not meet? And occasionally we get people that say there are none. This project is going to meet every single need of the community. And it's just not possible. It's not true unless you're doing a huge multi-million-dollar project. And so, while I understand that the biggest needs might be met, let us know what else is happening in the community, just so that we can have an understanding of what all it is that you spoke with them about. After reading the community assessment, we still don't really understand how the project was designed. So you did the community assessment and they talked about the need for, teacher training and working with students who have special needs, and the global grant is applying for a school feeding program. We can't connect the dots there, and it doesn't make sense as to why that's coming in. And then only infrastructure needs were identified. As part of a project, certainly, you should be looking into the infrastructure, and so that you can know what is needed, but it shouldn't be the only thing that's assessed, even in a survey. So the project design should be based on community assessment. It should ensure programmatic and quality sustainability, which is what Abby spoke about a little bit earlier. Intervention should be technologically and culturally appropriate. So you want to make sure that your intervention is not, 10 light years ahead of where the community is. You want to design your project with monitoring and evaluation in mind. Sorry about that typo. So you want to make sure that as you're designing your project, you are thinking about monitoring and evaluation, which I will talk about in just a minute. And keep in touch with the community once the project has ended, just to hear how things are going. This is going to help you long-term to plan other projects and to be able to make adjustments or enhancements to future projects. So making this connection. So when you're going into a school, if you're going to do the assessment, this is just an example, but if you went into a school and you did an assessment, you would want to have an understanding from a national level what the education strategy is. Then you may want to ask about test scores, grades, learning challenges that the students have. You would want to understand and know more about teaching strategies, their learning levels, the attitudes of the teachers and the students. You'd want to hear about the school population and infrastructure, of course. So, you'd want to take note of toilets, electricity, school desks, that sort of thing should be included. Have a talk with the school administration and the PTA. What is the school budget year to year? Could your potential interventions be continued on after the grant funding ended? And then what is the local community level of involvement, and also what are the literacy levels there? Because we know that when parents have higher literacy levels, their kids tend to stay in school longer and tend to perform better. And so, that's something to keep in mind, because you may be able to do something to help the adults in their literacy levels grow. So then you come up with your proposals and you decide that, okay, well, with my national education strategy, I'm going to do these interventions. And I'm not going to go through the whole one because I don't want to take up all of our time tonight, but and you come up with what your proposals are going to be. After you take a look at your proposals, you decide, As a result of this, I think that these are the outcomes that we're going to find. We'll have better learning outcomes, higher quality of teachers, and perhaps next level readiness would be another one if you were to go through all of them. But if you're not finding that your school assessment is informing what you propose to do, and you don't think that what you're proposing to do is actually going to help you to achieve your outcomes, I would say that's a big red flag for your project. And then it's time to really reconsider what it is that you want to do. So the three things I just wanted to touch on tonight that we see coming through in our challenges are quality of teacher training that comes in, the technology projects that we see, and then monitoring and evaluation. So we often get asked, what are you looking for when you say you want to have professional development for teachers? So I think that the most basic way to answer that is that we want to see a training that enhances the skills of teachers so that they can do their jobs better. And their job at the end of the day is to help students increase their learning. And so the examples that I'm providing for you today, whether it's the questions or the training, it's not limited to this. So please don't, marry this list and stay with it. But these are just some suggestions. And again, I could have pages and pages of suggestions on teacher training topics that you could do. But these are just a few that we see come through a lot based on needs. Blended learning, I'll talk about in just a moment, but the other ones are pretty straightforward, I think. I put curriculum in because you would be surprised at how many of the countries in the world where learning levels are the lowest, that the quality of the teachers or the training of the teachers or the education of the teachers is also the lowest. And oftentimes we've found that there's just a lack of understanding of the curriculum, of the government curriculum. And so when I put curriculum in, excuse me, what you may want to do is to work with a local university, a cooperating organization, or another group of experts that can provide just basic training on the government curriculum. This is also something to think about when governments have a new curriculum. So oftentimes governments update their curriculum every 3 to 5 years. And so helping bring teachers up to speed on those curriculum changes is really important as well. We want to make sure the appropriate amount of time is dedicated to training and topics. So if you're submitting an application and you want to do special needs education training, because that's what the teachers have shared that they're really struggling with, and we find that it's a 2-hour training for the entire length of the project, that's pretty questionable on how much information is really going to be gathered in that amount of time. The trainers should certainly be qualified, and please let us know who they are and how they were selected. By simply telling us that qualified trainers will be doing the training, we're going to definitely be asking more questions about who those trainers are and what their qualifications are, so that we can ensure that the training will be delivered. And these things really should be ideally identified before you submit your grant application. This should be a new training as a result of the grant. So it should not be something, that the teachers get year after year. This should be a result of your community assessment and a need from the teachers. So the other thing to a quality teacher training is that you're doing an assessment and not a needs assessment or a community assessment, but that you're actually assessing how well the teachers are doing in the training. Are they learning the information? Are they retaining it? And are they utilizing it in their classroom? And the best ways to know if they're using it in the classroom is to have some sort of an observation, whether it's through the trainers themselves or even people who attended the training could observe one another. And they could, help to assess one another. And plan follow-up trainings when possible. They can be done online nowadays, or they can be done in person, but I think follow-up training is really important. We find with teacher training that when teachers go into the classroom and they try to use what they've learned within their training, if it doesn't work that first time, they'll almost always revert back to the old way of teaching. And so that's why this piece is so important, and it really contributes to the sustainability of the project. And then the last thing is creation of communities of practice. And so this is really something that we've seen come out of global grants, even when we haven't pushed for it or encouraged it, is that teachers at the trainings connect with one another, and they stay in touch through WhatsApp, or because they're living in the same area, they might get together and they message each other and they say, hey, this worked in my classroom today. Did it work for all of you? Or somebody might say, no, that didn't work for me. Well, you could maybe try this. And those communities of practice can really strengthen the training that they've learned, because it's constantly reinforcing the information. Sorry, actually the last thing is the benchmark. So we want to make sure that the teachers know how they're being successful. So, you know, when you're doing your training, you want to make sure that the teachers have an understanding that, you know, if this is successful, these are the results that you should see in your classroom. You may see other results and you're going to have failures, but this is how you know that you're doing what you're doing is actually working in your classroom. Technology projects are coming in hot to the Rotary Foundation, and they are, because this is a newer area in education and especially in a lot of communities, they really run the spectrum in terms of quality. So I thought it was worth talking about just for a moment. You do want to make sure that the teachers have a basic understanding of computer knowledge before you're bringing computers into their classroom. And what you'll hear from us, oftentimes we'll see trainings come in that are very basic. It's teaching the teachers how to turn a computer on and off. It's doing basic troubleshooting, how to set up an email address, how to Google things. And all of that is fine, as long as it's not the only training that you're doing. It has to be accompanied with something a little bit more sophisticated and certainly more related to the classroom. Blended learning, ideally, especially when you are putting in a computer or a computer aid or something like that actually into the classroom itself, blended learning is really important. So you want to make sure that in blended learning, it's partially in person and it's partially computerized learning, and it's an instructional shift. So you're not simply telling the teacher's not simply replacing the computer with what they did in the classroom before the computer came in, or replacing the tablets with things like, you know, with a book, you know, replacing books with a tablet, but there's actually an instructional shift, and that they're working with the students on their critical thinking skills now, that they're utilizing small group learning, personalized differential learning. Those are all really important when we're thinking about technology projects. Technology is a great tool in the classroom for student assessment and to see how much your students are learning so that you can personalize their learning experience. And so if you have very, very little knowledge of technology, you can understand that this would be an overwhelming thing for a teacher to utilize. And so this is a great training opportunity on how to utilize the technology to assess students in their learning journey. And then again, the differentiated learning training. Differentiated learning means that you're looking at the assessment information that you're getting back, and you're creating a personalized learning experience for your student based on where they're at in their classroom. This could be a huge help in classrooms where they have a large number of children, you know, 50 kids in a classroom, 60 kids in a classroom, because you can start to group kids together based on where they're at, and they can work in those small groups so that they can start learning from one another, and the teacher can give those smaller groups the personalized attention that they need and deserve. So I thought we could have a little fun and do a quick little putting it into practice exercise, and then I'm almost done. So Tracy is a language, this is not my own. I did not write this. I will give credit on the next slide to where I got it from. But Tracy is a language arts teacher who has posted all of her lesson plans, assignments, and quizzes online so that students can access them at home as well as at school. Tracy's school recently implemented a program in which each student has access to a personal computing device. To leverage the technology, Tracy has all of her students follow along on their devices during a guided reading exercise, during which the teacher and students examine a piece of text together. After a class discussion on the text, Tracy has the students switch over to Google Docs, where they each write their own agreement or disagreement with the central argument of the text. During this time, Tracy roams the classroom, making sure students are on task and answering any questions that arise. So I would say this is a pretty common use of a computing device in schools. But my question to everybody is Tracy using blended learning in her classroom? Please write yes or no into the chat box if you can. And I can't see the chat box, so Carolyn or Abby, if you could tell me what people are writing, that would be helpful. Oh, maybe I can't see the chat box actually. Seeing some yeses and some nos. Okay, good. So the answer is no. And I'll tell you why. So in this case, the internet is used to just host information. It's not shifting the instruction at all. The tablets are being used to read information at this, all the students are reading it at exactly the same time, just as you would if you were just reading out of a textbook. Google Docs in this situation is just replacing pen and paper. There hasn't really been a change to the delivery of instructions or methods of learning or gathering information. And this project is a change in the classroom environment, but it's not an enhancement to the quality of the education that they were receiving before. So, you know, technology should allow students to take control of their own learning in a way, in a facilitated way, and enhance their critical thinking skills, allowing them to work in groups, allowing them to learn at their own pace. And that's just that just names a few ways that technology can really be utilized in the classroom. And last, monitoring and evaluation. It should happen, as I said, from throughout the project. So please don't wait until the end of your project and utilize it as an afterthought of, oh, we should remember to count how many teachers were trained. We should be thinking about this all along. It's really important in order to have a successful project. Schools and communities, it should be a simple enough method that they can do this on their own once the grant funding has ended, so that they can continue evaluating how their school is doing. Monitoring without evaluation is useless. So just simply counting numbers and looking at things, but not actually making tweaks to your project as you go, is not the purpose of monitoring and evaluation. It's not, we're not doing it just as an extra add-on. It's really important. Quantity is okay. Measuring quality is even better, but if you do both, that's when you get the gold star. So you want to be looking at not just how many people are coming to school or how many students are coming to school, but you want to look at how they're learning by looking at their grades, looking at their test scores and things like that. And when possible, align your monitoring and evaluation with global or national education standards. That's really how you're going to know how your school is doing compared to the rest of the world, or your project is doing compared to others happening. So my closing tips: work with the community. As Abby said, I'm going to be repeating a lot of Abby's things here. You know, community-driven solutions to problems, equal empowerment and ownership. Focus on quality, not quantity or access only. Rely on expertise, especially when it comes to training. Don't, you know, just because you received an education at one point in your life does not mean that you have the skills to train teachers in order to deliver an education. Please don't just do training as an extra to an infrastructure project so that you can get your global grant trained. Please, 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 I beg you, every Rotarian that you talk to, tell them to take this part of their project very seriously. I promise, if you do, you will come out with a better project and a much more sustainable experience. And please provide as much information as you can when submitting an application. So often applications are declined, And a lot of it comes down to the fact that things were just not communicated properly. And having that communication is just so, so critical. And that is all from me. So I'm happy to take any questions, and I know Abby is too. Thank you.
Super, that was great. As you're going through, Mary Jo, I'm thinking of, yeah, I could tell this story and I could tell that story. Just two observations. We talk about teacher training quite a bit, and that's the language that's in the grants. I'd suggest that we shift our thinking and shift our language a bit. So it's less about teacher training. All of the teachers or most of the teachers in the classroom have been trained, received training. It's more about professional development. And if you're a doctor or you're an engineer or you're an attorney, whatever you do professionally, you receive ongoing professional development over the course of your career. And this is it, but that doesn't happen for teachers many times and in many, many locations. And I just encourage people to look at it less about training teachers and more about ongoing professional development for teachers. One other thing that I've found really helpful when doing professional development programs for teachers, especially in developing countries, but anywhere, is to consider having working with their local Ministry of Education and having some kind of certification at the end. You typically won't be able to do that for a one-day training, but if you're doing ongoing professional development, you have 2 or 3 or 4 sessions over the course of a year. If the teachers have a certificate at the end, they can often use that for their certification to keep their certification renewed, and that's important. It's important to them. It's often important for their pay scale. And it really reinforces that, yes, we're treating teachers as professionals. So a couple of tips. We have time for a few questions, and I'll get to the box here. If you'd like to get in touch with Abby or Mary Jo, this is their contact information. Would also really reinforce to be working with your grants officer for the area where you're looking to do the grant, implement the grant. They're a great source of information, and working with them ahead of time, kind of saying, we're thinking of this, we're looking at doing that, can help a lot of problems in the end. It makes sure that you have the information that you need ready to roll when you actually submit the application. And also reinforcing to look at the cadre of technical advisors. And I know there's several on the call tonight. Look at your cadre of technical advisors. They're great resources for helping you with putting the grant together. Looking at some of those community assessments and monitoring and evaluation, and also ideas on project design. And then also certainly working through BELRAG, and we can match you up with people that have expertise in the area where you're looking to help coach you through a grant as well. So several questions that came up, and I can't find my question. There they are. One question, do you know how many Rotarians on average are involved in developing projects, groups of Rotarians? I don't know, Abby, maybe you might be able to share that.
So it's an excellent question. I do not have the answer to that because it really depends upon what the project is in terms of the involvement. So, we always have those stories where there's one person in the club who's involved in a project. That is not a best practice. But then we have ones where really multiple clubs, or there are a lot of people involved. I don't know if Mary Jo has anything to add to that from what you've seen, but yeah, we don't have a statistic on that, however.
We have another question about finding it being a challenge sometimes to find partner NGOs and working with local NGOs. Ideas on how to find good NGO partners.
So that's a great question. I think that, I think the community a lot of times is aware of NGOs that are working within their community. Oftentimes you go into communities and you see their logos everywhere. So you can sometimes just see what's happening. I also think that if there's a local UNICEF office in the country, you could reach out to their office and find out which they should, in most cases, have it mapped out, which NGOs are working in which areas. And you can usually find it that way. The other way, though, is that if you're working in a community that's had a recent emergency or, whether it's a natural disaster or something like that, oftentimes there's a cluster functioning in that country, which I know in American English, it sounds a little crazy to say there's cluster working, but it's a United Nations group that's formed specifically of NGOs, private sector groups, so the efforts aren't duplicated. So you can look into, like, for example, I worked with one of our RGOs just the other day on a project in Colombia that's working with Venezuelan refugees, and we are hopefully going to put the Rotarians in touch with the education cluster working on that situation, because they'll know, sort of they'll have a lay of the land on what's happening. And it's a great question, because it's important, obviously, so that you don't duplicate efforts, but also because oftentimes in countries, NGOs are concentrated to one area of a country. So, you may find that if you're working in Guatemala, for example, you'll have one NGO that's more concentrated in the northern part, another one that does more work down in the south. And so it's better to work with those local organizations that have that are doing work in a specific area. So you're not trying to bring people all the way across the country.
That also speaks to the importance of the international partner and the host Rotary Club partner working really closely together. As the international partner, you can go in and know just exactly what it is you want to do, but you get so much information by working with your local host Rotary Club, and they know often will know who are the quality NGOs and who are the ones that you want to avoid, who are the ones that are working in a particular area, and where are they not. Possibly getting in touch with Peace Corps volunteers that are working in the area. They're aware of the NGOs that are working in a particular area as well.
Yeah, and the other thing I was going to say too is I just lost my train of thought. I had two things to say, but one of them was that you could always reach out to me. Oh, the Ministry of Education is another great one. They'll know which NGOs are working in the country on education projects. And then, not necessarily as a last resort, but you're always welcome to reach out to me as well. We have a strategic partner in the Global Partnership for Education who works in about 68 countries, and they're very good about putting us in touch with local partners working on the ground as well.
You had a question, and I put it back in the chat box, but about getting in touch with Cadre. Just send an email to cadre@rotary.org, let them know what you're looking for, and they'll match you up with a Cadre, either in the appropriate area of focus or in the country where you're looking to work. And similarly, the email for BELRAG, or the website for BELRAG is on here, and you can send a general inquiry through BELRAG, and we can get you matched up with someone that's working in your area as well. Abby, what's the status of the World Fund being able to fund global grants for the rest of the year? Are there enough funds to continue?
All right, excellent question. There have been a lot of rumors this year, and we got some very good news this week. So demand remained really, really high for global grants this year. We did a record number of grants in the first quarter. So the trustees have been monitoring our global grant budget very, very closely because the demand was so high. And this week, both the trustees and the RI board approved an addition of $15 million more in World Fund to help us continue to finance global grants, hopefully through the end of the year. That's the goal in what we're looking at. So those are just the matching funds on global grants. Again, there's a lot of really great activity going on this year, but by all means, continue developing those applications and sending them in.
Super. And we're almost at the end of our time. We'll do one more question. When applying for a global grant, can the DDF portion be used for equipment? I don't know, Abby, Mary Jo, you want to talk about how the funds are allocated out?
Yes, and I think sometimes people use the term DDF when they mean district grants, the block grants to the districts. And that grant type is perfect for equipment purchases at schools. That's an ideal grant type to use. The district grant is funded out of DDF. That said, global grants use that blend of funding, and some of that is DDF. For a global grant, the thing that's important to us is that you have this holistic project that is targeting that big goal within the area of focus, and that you have your project plan getting you all the way to that big goal. Some of what may get you to that big goal is having some equipment that may be needed that is very unlikely to be the entire project for a global grant for that kind of funding. So we absolutely fund equipment through global grants, but again, there are a lot of other things going on in the project. I mean, just to cite the obvious example that Mary Jo's been talking about, you know, there's all that work with the teachers that you typically see in basic education and literacy global grant.
Super, thanks. We are at the end of our time for this evening. Again, thanks to Abby and to Mary Jo for sharing their expertise. It's hugely appreciated. This webinar will be repeated tomorrow. So if you didn't get enough today and want to come back for confirmation, then we'll do it again tomorrow with another group of Rotarians. We're also through BELRAG looking, as I mentioned, to doing a series of webinars. We're looking at one possibly focused on technology. If there's a particular area that you would like us to look into where it would be helpful for your club and your projects, let us know, and we'll see if we can tailor one around an interest of yours or a greater interest of Rotarians. And I need to put a plug in too for BELRAG. If you're not a member of BELRAG, we'd love to have more of you get involved. The website is right there, and it's a great way to coordinate, to collaborate with other Rotarians interested in education projects, and just a really good learning experience and way to share information. So I really encourage you, if you're not involved in BELRAG, we'd love to get you with us. So that does it for this evening. Abby and Mary Jo, again, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for your expertise. It's been great having you with us this evening. And thanks to everyone who's participated this evening. Greatly appreciate it. We'll send out a survey. And if you have specific questions, then you can get back in touch with us by email. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Good evening.